Hey, this is Elwin Robinson, and I'm joined today by Matthew Amsden, who is the founder of Efforia and an expert in the subject of clinical research. Now, clinical and scientific research. Now, this is something that's fascinating to me, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation because, of course, clinical research, scientific research is the arbiter of truth in this day and age as to what is real, what is not, what is helpful, what is not, what is effective, and what is not. And I feel that a lot of the time, things in my world, which a lot of people might call alternative health, I like to call it natural health, are dismissed because there is a lack of research to support that they are effective. And, that's a reasonable criticism to some degree. But the problem, of course, is that it's also very difficult to do that research to prove its effectiveness. And a lot of people in my industry would say that there's reasons for that, maybe conspiratorial. And so I'm very happy to have Matthew on today, who I would say is not necessarily in the same camp as me. I think you're the first person, Matthew, I've ever had on who is not, very much ensconced in the alternative or natural health world, even though you may consider yourself part of that, but you're also in the mainstream, right? Yeah, and so I'm fascinated to have you on to share your experience. So welcome to the podcast, Matthew.
Thank you. I do want to make one clarification here because we've already started to get into some touchy areas. I think a lot of people would not recognize me as being a clinical research expert. Traditionally, in the clinical research world, the individual who has the dermatology degree or is the cardiologist or works in an academic medical center, these are the individuals who are generally considered those who have clinical research expertise. And they definitely do. I come from a very different perspective. I actually worked and continue to work with a lot of those people, but I'm not a dermatologist, I'm not a cardiologist, I'm not a nephrologist. I come at the world of clinical research from the perspective of operations, logistics, and technology. A clinical research study really is kind of a repeated recipe that is conducted in exactly the same way for each participant that goes through the research study. So I do consider myself a research methodologist, though from an educational perspective, I have an MBA. It's not necessarily a scientific orientation. Research methodology really focuses on the operations and the underlying approaches of the clinical research study. The actual topic matter expertise, those individuals who are coming up with the hypotheses, are people like yourselves in the natural research world, or in the traditional medical world. They're the people like the dermatologists and the cardiologists and the nephrologists.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. I guess that brings straight to what I was going to ask next, which is about your background. We can start in the beginning because it's very interesting and it's very wide and varied. And yeah, maybe expert wasn't the right word, but someone highly experienced in that world maybe would have been a better way of putting it.
Yeah, we're dealing in a world today where everything is somewhat politicized, particularly the research world, which honestly really should not be politicized, but it happens to be at the moment. And I want to make sure that everyone understands that I'm coming to this conversation with all of my cards on the table and not trying to put somebody else out of the business or say that somebody is not good or I'm doing things better. So I think it's really important to be open and honest about what my expertise is and where I come to this. So
Yes, I would say from my perspective, I've not met anyone who has more expertise in the world of clinical research. So that's probably
well,
where I was
thank you.
coming from.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, cool. So a little bit about my background. As I mentioned, did not intend to start in the world of research. I got an MBA in marketing, and I went to work for a .com right out of graduate school. However, I'm a little young to have participated in the big first bubble. I got in just as the bubble was bursting. And so within 6 months at some Boston area tech company, I realized saw the writing on the wall and I was not happy and knew I needed to jump ship pretty quickly. And it happened to be that there was a large public policy research and consulting firm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, called Apt Associates, that still exists today and is still one of the largest research consulting firms around the world. And essentially, what they do is they run evaluations and research studies largely for the US federal government, but also for local and international governments as well. They hired me to kind of add some technology to some of the research studies that they were doing and some of the programs that they were doing. and also take the big 300-page reports that these researchers have put together that generally just ended up on a shelf in somebody's office that nobody actually read and used, and turn them into things, the little bite-sized pieces that someone might actually be able to put into practice. Because what these evaluations and what these research studies were meant to do was essentially to influence public policy in a way that produced better outcomes. It was nonpartisan by its very nature, but if money was being spent on a program to reduce recidivism, for example, and it didn't work, we obviously didn't want to replicate that across every city in the United States. Likewise, if there was a very complicated program that did show some promise, we needed to put it in a format that allowed someone in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Bangor, Maine, or Omaha, Nebraska, or in Manchester, England, also implement that program in a way that actually made sense and was consistent, because we want to, everyone wants to spend money on things that work to create a better society for all of us. So I took that job and actually had a fantastic time. And what was very fortuitous about it was at about that time, most Western governments, so I was spending at this time a lot of time in the UK as well, and a lot of time in Latin America also, identified HIV as a solvable issue. We know what causes HIV. We know how to prevent HIV. And so the thinking at that point was, if we just throw a whole bunch of behavioral interventions up against the wall and see if we can get primarily gay and bisexual men to change their behaviors, HIV will go away. Now, we know that that's very naive today, but at that point, that really was the thinking. Wear a condom, practice safe sex, we can make HIV go away. The research studies that were being done by very well-established researchers were, at that point, were starting to hit barriers. The techniques that they were using to engage gay and bisexual men, the traditional techniques tended to be enrolling individuals in hookup parks and saunas and gay bars. They weren't working anymore. And for a short period of time, they tried to move a lot of the recruitment to men's health clinics in major cities in London and Paris, New York, Los Angeles. That didn't work either, because at that point, some of the harder to reach audiences wouldn't go to one of those clinics, because someone might see them walk in and say, oh, that person is gay, and they were still in the closet. So that was a no-go as well. A couple of very smart researchers in some of the largest cities in the United States recognized that a lot of those big 300-page reports that I was pulling into different little pieces, I was putting them online in blogs and in little snippets and things like that. And they started to wonder, can we do some of those same things and actually engage our audience, which, we're not policy experts and social service providers, but gay men in general. And they came to me and said, can you do a little recruiting for us online? And this was well before the world of online recruitment for clinical trials, which is very common these days. It was not even 10 years ago. And I shrugged my shoulders and said, sure, why not? That became fairly successful. And so they quickly came back and said, well, we can't get them into the clinic. We can't find them where they are. You're great at recruiting them. Can we collect a little data online as well? And I shrugged my shoulders and said, sure. And so we collected a little bit of data. Fast forward by 2011, 2012, I was doing large-scale randomized control trials well before the world of decentralized trials was a thing, completely and entirely online. They ranged almost all in HIV prevention, but ranged in scale and scope from 60 or 70 participants all the way up. The largest one that I did was 15,000 participants. I didn't necessarily want to spend my whole career in HIV research, and I will be very honest with you, the number of mistakes that I made in these efforts was stunning. Nobody really knew how to do this at this particular point. The process of developing the infrastructure was incredibly difficult and took years, and the ethics boards and the regulators didn't necessarily know how to deal with it. So I decided to take a lot of what I learned and turn it into a company itself that created a platform, so I wasn't reinventing the wheel of this infrastructure for every single research study. And that was my first company in 2013.
Oh, very interesting. Okay. And so that's the first company you founded in 2013. And then what did that company do? Like, can you give us some of the greatest hits, I guess?
Yeah, what I really wanted to do with that company was to democratize, and this was in the age of it was a venture backed company. In the age of venture backed companies democratizing everything, in much the same way that anyone could become a journalist, anyone could become a stockbroker, anyone could become an entertainer on YouTube. I wanted to do the same thing with clinical research. The reality was that the regulations, the complexity of designing a research study really required a significant amount of additional infrastructure and knowledge that not only myself, but nobody really had at that particular point. So very quickly, we started to shift into more traditional academic pharmaceutical and some large nonprofit trials. So I did one of the very early trials that we did was with Planned Parenthood in the United States, looking at different ways to educate women about their reproductive options. We did another series of studies with Aura Ring, looking at how that could track individuals who were in treatment recovery. Um, the largest studies towards the end tended to be in the pharmaceutical world. So I worked both with US and European pharmaceutical companies on some very large efforts that included a lot of connected health devices and genetics testing.
Oh, interesting. Fantastic. All right. So you can see, viewer, listener, why I said Matthew has expertise in this area, even if he's not actually a clinical researcher. So let's talk a bit about clinical research. So obviously, I'm asking from the perspective of someone who facilitates it as opposed to actually does it, as you've clarified. But let's talk about the upsides and the potential problems with it. I'll do like a brief intro in my view, and then you can tell me where you think I'm right and wrong. I think like working out what isn't true and working out what isn't helpful and effective up until the scientific method, which was invented maybe was it 250 years ago by Newton. Is all about convention and authority, right? This is the way that we've always done it, and this person with this authority for whatever reason, they're the tribal elder, they're the priest, they have some connection with God or the spirits or something, and so they know the way to do things, and that's pretty much how we did things for a long time, as far as I'm aware, throughout recorded history. I'm fairly familiar with TCM as well, which is the Chinese medicine system, and I think with that there was a lot of, again, supposedly, and I guess I agree with it, very wise people who went out into nature and experimented a lot of stuff and brought their insights back, and eventually that got codified into a systematic way of doing things that became dogmatic to some degree and is still practiced to this day throughout a lot of the world. But so basically it's inspiration to authorities to convention. The scientific method came along, and it was this basic idea of truth should actually be evaluated by experimentation and by, what I call imperialism, like what actually produces objective results in the real world. And in order to find that, we need to actually create hypotheses and then do tests and evaluate our results and all of that kind of stuff that you can, go into in more detail if you want. And so to me, that was a really wonderful thing. And I think that a lot of breakthroughs have happened because of that. And I'm a huge fan of the scientific method. I think where a lot of people in my industry are a little bit weary of it, though, these days, is it just feels like it's been co-opted to some degree by various interests. And it's kind of gone back to that system as it's been a long time, like it was all along. It's appeals to invention and appeals to authority. And so I'd say that's my biggest criticism of the industry. And the other big criticism I think most people in my world would say is that it's so difficult to do and so expensive that the only people who can do it are huge corporations. And then a bigger criticism that you might consider more conspiratorial is that that those who have vested interests in kind of maintaining a monopoly or maintaining a market share will kind of look to reduce the funding or reduce the opportunities for anyone who is in a competing industry from being able to participate in clinical research. So I know that's a lot, but that's my understanding. And I wanted to share what I think is probably the view of most of my audience for then you to say, what you feel clinical research is, what are the benefits of it, and what are the problems with it in this day and age.
Yes, I think the most important spot to start with all of this, in my experience working both with the pharmaceutical sector, in academia, with smaller organizations, little mom and pop nonprofits, nobody is happy with the clinical research process as it exists now. I've never spoken to anyone who is essentially like, we can only do it this way for the future because it's perfect. The reality is that at this particular juncture, a clinical research study is so wonky, difficult, and expensive that unless you have a huge pot of money and a regulatory requirement to do so, you're probably not going to do it. It's just not realistic. And that really is too bad because a clinical research study is really an unbelievably powerful thing to help not only us as a general world determine what works, but also us individually. I often think about what our cavemen ancestors might do if they were trying to figure something out. And so, if you can imagine for a moment, you're a caveman and you're walking down a path and you see a bush of berries. At that particular point, as humans, we are beginning to show what we are as humans, which is this species that evolved to self experiment. We look at those berries and we go, I wonder what that berry is going to taste like. I wonder if it's going to be good. And so we would do an experiment and we would taste that berry. If that berry was bitter and poisonous and made us sick, we would spit it out. And that is the outcome. No more of that, and we would then make it generalizable knowledge and share it with our village. Likewise, if the berry was super tasty or it created some other kind of outcome, we would eat it again. And likewise, we would take that individual knowledge and share it with our community. I think where the problem comes today is that we've largely outsourced a lot of those kinds of efforts because the kinds of things that we are looking at as far as measurements go are much more nuanced than does this berry taste good or is this berry poisonous. If you're a body hacker or someone interested in longevity, you're interested in improving your mitochondrial health. Well, you can't do that with just your taste buds on your tongue. And so we've outsourced it to someone who is in a different city, maybe has a different set of interests, maybe have a different set of perspectives, and they do a study, and then we get a result, and that result is supposed to apply to us. Now, clearly with my accent, I'm American. Every American child in Generation X, Millennial, and older Generation Z, we all grew up with Sesame Street and Mister Rogers. And in that, we are told over and over and over again, it's literally in the theme songs of all of these children's shows, that we are special and unique. And yet, from an overall health perspective, when we're talking about evidence, that evidence largely comes down as here's the report, this is generalizable knowledge, it applies to you. And so when we enter in very serious situations and environments like the COVID pandemic, and we are all, particularly Americans, are taught that we are unique and special, and we suddenly get all of this stuff coming to us saying that this is exactly what you need to do and there is no deviation. That starts to kind of raise spidey sense among some people. Now, I want to be very clear here. I was vaccinated. I continue to support vaccination across all efforts. But I do recognize that the way science kind of progressed at that particular point was very different than it had prior to the pandemic period, as opposed to this very long process of very careful, methodical research. All of a sudden, there was this process of, we're all figuring it out together. How do we do this? We're not really sure. And so we're going to put research studies out there. And the reality is research studies are extremely expensive. And so there's a limited amount of resources out there. And so individuals who I think did a very commendable job had to make decisions about what research studies were going to be funded during the pandemic and what were not, just as before and after. And they made those decisions, I think, quite commendably so. And we ended up with the results that we have. The problem is, over the period of the last 20 or 30 years, coming back to what I wanted to do with my first company, in many sectors we have been all led to believe we can become experts as well. We can be our own journalists. I mean, you are clearly your own journalist here in this podcast. We can be our own entertainment. We can produce entertainment for others. We have yet to be in a situation where we can be our own researchers. And yet, because so many of us now have seen a clinical trial headline on above the fold on every newspaper and every magazine over the past 5 to 10 years, we all are beginning to feel like, well, we're experts too. Combine that with the process and the reality that both in Western Europe and in North America, life expectancies have either flatlined or started to go down, and we see a lot of kind of general health issues.
I was
People
going to
don't
say,
necessarily.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't quite agree that everyone is like, keen to bring on this, take upon themselves this mantle of expertise. I think it's more an extreme level of disillusionment with the experts, like that we keep being told to trust the experts and that they keep being wrong. And what you just said, which is why I decided to interrupt, is a perfect example of it, right? If these experts are so authoritative and infallible, then why are our health outcomes becoming worse and worse, right?
The researchers that are out there now in academia and pharma are doing research where there is funding available. And knock on wood that I don't ever have an orphan disease or some kind of rare cancer or neurological disease. I am incredibly grateful that those people have been doing that research because there are now treatments out there for it. The reality is, however, because of where research funding has gone, a lot of the more kind of basic underlying questions about what makes a person healthy, what prevents certain issues, the funding hasn't been there to do so. And because the average research study costs at least low seven figures to do something kind of at a pharma level, and if you're doing something more kind of short and dirty, it's still probably going to cost six figures. The reality is that those studies just don't get done under the current research model. I think that it is very short-sighted overall to suggest that anyone is being nefarious or anyone is putting up false barriers. There might be some people that are doing that. The reality is the research business model, the clinical trial business model, only works for a very narrow set of individuals who are very well connected, who have a research interest that is currently in the same interest areas as the funders have, and those funders have limited resources as well. And so that's the research that's been done. And again, if you are in a situation where you have a rare cancer or you have some kind of neurological disease, thank God that research has been done because there's now treatment for that. But if your research interests are in some of the areas where I think a lot of the individuals who are listening to this podcast are, that research hasn't necessarily been done. And the way I think it's been co-opted a little bit by the media in some of these areas that have been less researched is they say things like there's no evidence. And they equate that concept of no evidence with it doesn't work. And that's not what that means. And I want to make this very clear. The lack of evidence is not proof of inefficacy. It only means the research study has not been done.
That's a fantastic point. Right. So next time you hear someone say there's no evidence, remember that doesn't mean that it doesn't work. It only means no one's tested to see if it works. It's such an important distinction. I know I'm just repeating you, but I really wanted to highlight that.
Yeah. Yeah. It is really, really important that, and I see it happen in the media all the time. It's just the scientific process is very methodical. Evidence is there to prove or disprove a hypothesis. If you haven't collected the data to prove or disprove the hypothesis, or you haven't collected enough data, that doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means there's not enough there to make a decision at that point.
And just to pick up on your point of nefariousness, it's like nefariousness kind of implies, evil. And honestly, I do think there is evil in the world, but you and I don't need to debate that. But if we put that aside for a moment, and I agree with you, then the other thing that's often talked about is that the challenge is that, so for pharmaceutical drugs, they're patentable, at least for a period of time. Whereas, most natural substances, vitamins, minerals, amino acids, they are not patentable. And therefore, if someone spends, as you just said, a large amount of money researching it, they are unlikely to be able to recoup the cost. And so it's not, even if you remove the nefariousness thing out of it, the reason why, as you just said, a lot of the time they say there's no evidence that these natural things work, it's because no one's willing to pay to check if they work, because there's no way of making money out of it. Is that correct?
Effectively, that is correct. Part of the reason why we want to encourage patents in the pharmaceutical sector is it gives them the wherewithal and the confidence that they might be able to make money off of some of the drugs that they put out there. Because the reality is, I don't. I'm going to say this, but I could be wrong. I believe less than 30% of the drugs that start in a typical pharmaceutical pipeline actually make it to a point where they even get to a trial, much less in a trial. And then trial success rates are very low as well. And so they've got to see a good return in order to spend the money on the trial, because it's just that expensive.
Genetic Insights provides cutting-edge, affordable DNA testing, giving you access to over 500 health reports that can help you in 3 key ways. They may be able to resolve your existing health challenges even when nothing else has worked. Using simple lifestyle changes, their reports can help you reduce your risk of developing future health challenges that you may be genetically predisposed to. And they can help you feel more confident in your health by showing you where you are genetically strong. Unlike most other genetic health testing companies, Genetic Insights tests over 83 million different variations in your genes, guaranteeing 99.7% accuracy across all of their DNA reports. They cover almost every aspect of health, including digestive issues, cardiovascular health, weight loss, hormonal and blood sugar balance, as well as nutrient needs, allergies and intolerances, and so much more. Using their system is quick and easy, and reading the reports is simple. If you've done an Ancestry DNA test, you can simply download your raw DNA data, upload it to the Genetic Insights platform, and within a few hours you will have access to genetic reports which give you a risk score for each specific issue and scientifically validated recommendations based on your individual genetic profile. Everything in your reports are based on scientific studies, and there are citation links throughout every report. If you are serious about optimizing your health and wellness and feeling great, then getting access to your Genetic Insights reports may be the most important health investment you will ever make. In the reports, not only will you gain insights into how to overcome existing health challenges and avoid future issues, you'll also discover which types of dietary, lifestyle, and even supplement protocols are best for your unique genetics. To get your unique genetic health reports, go to geneticinsights.co and use code Rejuvenate to get 20% off today. That's geneticinsights.co using coupon code Rejuvenate to get 20% off today.
Yeah, and I don't begrudge them that. It's fair enough. If you're a business, if you keep losing money, you're going to cease to exist, and you're not going to be able to help anyone. And that brings me to the other point. Even if you're not really talking about nefariousness, it's just, the way that the law is set up in your country and in my country is that, board of directors that, should be running a company and making decisions for it are meant to prioritize the shareholder value above all else, as long as they're not actively breaking the law. And so making decisions that increase their own market share and in turn reduce market share of the competition, it's just business as usual. It's true in every area of business, of every type of business. It's just when it comes to the area of health, and there are people suffering and there are people dying, it's easier to feel that it's nefarious that they're doing that. But again, if you were to take all those people away and replace them with a brand new board of directors who are all, well-meaning, soon enough they would have to be taking similar actions, because that's the way that the system is set up. That's the incentives that they have in place. So I don't think necessarily the people involved are nefarious. I think it's more that the incentive structure literally the law as it's currently set up will lead to that kind of behavior of trying to reduce competition and increase their own market share. That's what they're supposed to do. Otherwise, they're failing in their fiduciary duty.
It is true. And I mentioned at the top of this discussion, my background is in business. I have an MBA. I am a capitalist through and through. I believe in that model. And I believe in that model that if you are innovative enough, you can find ways to essentially address multiple issues at the same time. If you are addressing your market needs, depending on how you how you define what those needs are, you can solve those issues. The pharmaceutical industry has set itself up to define a needs of someone is sick and ill. Someone has an orphan cancer disease. There are many other organizations. I happen to be part of multiple groups that are primarily based on the east and west coast of the United States, but I'm sure that there are others of huge numbers of people who are looking to innovate the health space in for-profit businesses. There's massive amounts of innovation. It's just I do think that we are in somewhat of a kind of transition period between kind of the old sick care model and now a more preventative, more longevity focused model. I think there's going to be a lot of tension in that transition for a long time, but I do see a lot of people starting to shift, and they are continuing to do so in a business-minded orientation.
And when you say a lot of people, are you saying VCs, pharmaceutical companies? Are you talking about those kind of people, or as well?
Lots of VCs, lots of startup organizations, lots of nonprofits and social policy organizations too, looking for different ways to attack these issues, and they are doing so using business innovation.
That's awesome. Well, that's just a ray of hope, because I do think one of the people in my world are guilty of is a little bit too much of bleakness and nihilism about things getting better. So that's really nice to hear.
Well, remember, I am American, and that I think is embedded within our DNA. That everything always, we always put we address our issues, but at the same time, try to be very positive about it as well. And I think that that's incredibly important this day and age, because I do start to see people losing that capacity. You got to be positive. There's no other option.
I agree. I mean, I think when it's delusional, it's unhelpful, but when it is innovative, which is what you just said, it's helpful, right? And you have to be positive to think it's worth innovating something. And I agree, that's why a lot of innovation does come from the US.
All innovation is delusional until it becomes real, right?
That's a good distinction as well. Yeah, true. Just to go back to what you said there, you said the sick care system. So I think that's the other criticism, where people understandably do feel that it's nefarious, because they feel like, I don't want to just blame them. Again, pharmaceutical companies, educational, hospitals, the government, whatever you want to call it, but the system in general benefits more from treating people being sick rather than actually curing them, because you can keep making money off someone who needs a medication from you for the rest of your life, for instance, versus if they fix you, then they're no longer a customer of yours. And this is a bit of a problem with capitalism, I would say. I don't know if it's true, but I've heard theories, for instance, that the reason why electronic goods don't last as long as they used to is that it was like an intentional decision, because if they last if you buy a fridge and it lasts 20, 30 years, well, then you've just lost a customer. I can't remember, was it Instant Pot or something like that? There was one of these companies that came up with a great product, and then they made it so well that everyone bought one, and then no one needed to buy another one, and they started to, lose market share more and more. Now, I know, as you said, diehard capitalists, you probably say, well, they should innovate a new product, and you're probably right.
And that was literally going to be my next statement. Is that, and I think tried. But was unsuccessful in creating another version of their product and other ancillary versions, and that's happens.
Fair enough. Look, so basically, I do agree with you, because I don't think that you need to lose market share if you cure people, because there is more than just cure, that you can help people to optimize, right? Like, if you help people fix a problem, then you can help them to be smarter, you can help them to be stronger, you can help them to be more resilient, you can help them to be this. But that just isn't how most of these companies have fought up until now, unfortunately. And I think that leads to this thing of more focus on treating diseases than really resolving them. Not always, but too often.
One thing that I think is worthwhile to note for people like yourself and other listeners of this podcast is there is this perception that to be sick, you're going to need to treat yourself for whatever that. Let's say diabetes, for example. You're going to need to treat yourself for diabetes until the end of your days, and that if we prevented it, all of a sudden, all of those costs and all of that business opportunity and all of that economic opportunity would go away. That's just not realistic. I don't know, what your kind of daily health regimes are, but I can tell you mine take work and continued investment every single day, sometimes to the point where I am really tired and really bored of them. There is still opportunity there in some of the longevity and some of the kind of prevention orientation, um, for long-term revenue, because you can't just take a pill and all of a sudden, I never have to worry about diabetes again. It takes continued effort. And so the long-term ongoing revenue models are still there in those sectors as well.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's what I was saying. Prevention, optimization, absolutely. But I think maybe people like yourself are not, more than 50% of the population. A lot of people just don't want to think about this stuff until they've got a problem, and then they want to treat it. I think that's part of it, unfortunately.
And that comes down to a level of self-agency and self-determination that I remember dealing with it when I early on in the HIV and when I was doing HIV work. It's, there were just some people who were kind of like, I don't want to think about this right now. Um, that is a huge question. How do you engage individuals who are difficult to reach and who do not want to change, and just figure that they can take a pill later? I don't know that I have any answers for that. And if somebody does, then please let me know. I will move stuff around in my bank account and make sure I invest in you. Um,
Well, I think interventions and I don't know if this could be happen within a lifetime, but within generations, interventions that increase IQ and traits of conscientiousness would probably be the main predictors as to that people would be more interested in prevention and optimization rather than only fixing things once they're already broken. And I'm interested in stuff like that. I'm always looking at research for, increasing those things. Um, the other thing I wanted to bring.
it's not just that, by the way. It's also supporting individuals. I think we have to recognize that probably you and I, we have a great deal of agency in our ability to, like, I don't work in an office. Clearly, this is my current. I'm in a lakeside cabin in Maine. I can go out and swim. I can go out and take a run because I don't necessarily have a set schedule, even though I probably work 80, 70, 80 hours a week. I can get out in daylight and do the exercise I need. Likewise, I was appropriately educated in high school. I had to take home economics, so I know how to cook, and I have access to fresh fruits and vegetables. We have to also think about the systems that we live within, and also recognize that there are a large group of people that really would love to be able to do some of the things that we're talking about here, but they don't have the resources or the access to be able to do it. And those are also things that need to be addressed. It's not just, oh, I don't feel like it. It's sometimes there are just barriers there.
I would agree, and I would also add, education. The fact that the three biggest educational industries for adults, for people like me, are health, relationships, and wealth, is because none of those three things are taught within traditional education systems, and of course they should be, right? And it is criminal that, to me, that is not happening. And again, I don't know if it's nefarious or it's just incentive schemes that are set in place at some point that are hard to change, and all the rest of it. But yeah, as you just said, learning to cook, learning about nutrition, learning that if you do these things when you're younger, then it's going to pay dividends, both in terms of maybe investing and saving money, or investing in your health. We're just not taught that, and I agree. I was more just talking about on a like an individual level. I think like things that can be done nutritionally, for instance, and like removing, for instance, things like lead have been shown to reduce IQ, and if we can reduce lead from people's diets and environments, and that will help anyway. But that's just more my interest. But I agree with what you said. I'd also add in education. So yeah, I'm hopeful. I think there's a bunch of things that can be done and that are being done. That I do think the incentive structure is key, though. Like when I learned about TCM, the way that it worked, at least at some points in history, was you would pay a doctor every month to keep you well, and then as soon as you became unwell, you would stop paying them, and you would start paying them again once you were well. And I think that's such a great incentive system for prevention and long-term health. And I wish that our healthcare system was structured that way, and I think it would completely transform things.
Someone needs to model that out. Someone who has more Excel and financial modeling skills than I do.
Well, you know more of those people than me, so who knows? Maybe you'll make it happen indirectly. Okay, so yeah, but you're right. We've had a big picture conversation about the health of the world in general and stuff like that. Let's get back more to clinical research. So let's talk about let's talk about how clinical research is done. I think a lot of our viewers and listeners, you hear it constantly, and we've addressed, does there have to be clinical research for something to be valid? No, although of course it's good to prove its validity or not. How does it actually work? Why is it so expensive? What are the problems with it? Not kind of societally that we've really talked about, but like more specifically in a case by case basis. And then once we've done all that, we'll get into like the future of clinical research, which is the most exciting part.
So I'd say research at this point, let's take it, we've talked a lot about money here, so let's take it from the financial perspective. I'd say that there are three primary kind of funding orientations, two or three. The first is government and nonprofit funding. So in the United States, the National Institute of Health is the preeminent health research funder, probably in the world, certainly in the United States. That is where most or a large proportion of academic research is funded from. Then we have the pharmaceutical and biotech worlds. This is the kind of for-profit orientation that we talked about. They have a pipeline of different novel therapeutics, and as they work through their pipeline, some of them actually make it to the point where they start phase 1 through 4 clinical trials, and I'll get through phase 1 through 4 in a moment. And then a third category that might be a subcategory of that second I would call self-funded research. So this would be research that is conducted by an organization that may be a pharmaceutical organization, it may be a physician, it may be what's called an investigator-initiated study. So it's essentially someone outside of those two big buckets who essentially says, I want to run a research study, and they find the money to do so.
So when you see all those studies, for instance, like coffee is beneficial, and you see often it's funded by the coffee industry or something like that. Would that be in that third category then?
Generally, yes. It might also be in the academic funded category as well, where as opposed to that academic getting money from the government, they've gotten money from an industry trade group. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Awesome.
Yep. And then in that pharmaceutical category, there's phase 1 through 4 research. And that's basically, kind of moving down through the pipeline. Phase 1 is essentially to...
Actually, I'm sorry, before we get into this, could we maybe delineate to people the difference, because I just mentioned the coffee thing, between clinical study versus epidemiological study?
Yeah, sure. A clinical study is one where we actually have and control an intervention. Or this is the way I define it. Have or control an intervention. So we are enrolling somebody in a research study. Let's take coffee, for example. And we are saying, let's get you in this research study. We are going to give you, or we are going to control when you have the coffee. And we're going to track the results. An epidemiological study, that is more kind of population based, in my view. Where we are, oftentimes they're retrospective, but they can be prospective as well. And retrospective means that we're looking back in history. Prospective means we're looking forward in history. We're kind of tracking things. We're observing at a population level. Generally speaking, in the world of clinical research, studies that are prospective in nature, where you're actually controlling the intervention, are considered higher quality than those that are retrospective, because you're not controlling anything and you're asking somebody to remember what they've actually done, as opposed to being sure because you're controlling it yourself. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think a lot of the time when people, who are lay people, right, they see, study shows that, what did I see the other day? Walking upstairs is better for burning fat than running or something. I was like, now I live in a house with 5 flights of stairs. I was like, oh, that's interesting. That people who drink coffee live 5 years longer than people who don't. All that kind of stuff. A lot of the time, those are actually epidemiological, right? And so people don't necessarily realize. And the challenge of that, again, my layperson understanding is that You don't know if it's causative or correlative. So we don't actually know if let's say drinking coffee makes you live 5 years longer, or just the kind of person who lives 5 years longer happens to drink coffee, and that's the thing. Or the kind of person who walks upstairs a lot happens to lose weight more than someone who runs. And so
But
that
all of even though these things made the studies, we are not really, they're retrospective and we're not really sure what they mean. These are clues that we can use to kind of say, oh, maybe there's something here, and then we can use that to do a prospective
yes,
clinical study.
yes,
So when we're talking about coffee, if we like the Framingham Heart Study, which is world famous, it's been going on now. So Framingham, Massachusetts, I think it's been going on now for more than 50 years, tracking individuals and various risk levels. This is a retrospective study that is just ongoing, tracking the same people, and I think in many cases their offspring now, over many generations. And there is a very significant amount of research that's come out of those studies that have been used to actually infer prospective clinical research studies. That just because they're retrospective doesn't mean they're not valuable at all. It just means they may not be the end of the final definitive answer. It is a step in the process.
they're suggestive. They're suggestive. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so that's awesome. So that's explaining to people the difference. Sorry, I thought it was important to kind of clarify that. And so a clinical study is where, as you said, we're actually controlling the situation. Now, I want to have you explain phase one and all the rest of it, but I was having a conversation with Dr. Miriam, who you've met a couple of days ago, and we were talking about studies. And she said that a lot of the time, when she talks to her colleagues, other medical doctors about studies, they feel like if there's more than one ingredient or more than one variable in the study, then it kind of isn't real science. It isn't good enough. And this kind of blew my mind. I was wondering if you'd heard of this concept before. I mean, even if it's not true, I mean, I would assume it's not true, but are you familiar with this objection?
I honestly have not heard of it before. Um, I often am very excited about studies that I consider kind of umbrella treatments, because I don't necessarily believe there is one thing that's just going to solve all of your issues. It's generally a combination of things. And it is true that if you just study one thing, like if you just study curcumin, you're going to get the outcome on curcumin. But as we know, curcumin and black pepper together actually appear to have stronger outcomes. And so studying it together, and maybe studying it with some lifestyle interventions, and maybe some dietary change, those sorts of umbrella treatments, they actually oftentimes produce better outcomes. And I wish there were more studies that looked at those combination of elements, because then we would have not just curcumin does this, but we would have curcumin plus a dietary change plus walking 20 minutes every day plus coffee in the morning actually produces an even better outcome.
So I 100% agree with you. It totally makes sense to me. When she said that to me, I was like, that makes no sense at all. But there is this kind of tendency in the scientific world of wanting to isolate everything except for one variable, right?
Yeah.
Have I got that right?
Yeah. You do. And in what we've just talked about here, what we are doing is we are isolating the combination.
A combination of one variable. Yeah. Yeah. I would still see it that way. I think, yeah, that I think that they myopically narrow it down to only one compound rather than one set intervention, which, as I said, it doesn't make sense to me. So it's interesting you haven't really heard that objection. That's fair enough. Okay, so anyway, just to clarify then, so what we're talking about, it could be one compound, it could be a combination of several compounds, it could even be not a compound at all, it could be a lifestyle intervention or whatever, right? Like any one thing or any combination of things a clinical study can be done on. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. That's why it's called an intervention in clinical speak, or clinical trial speak, as opposed to a treatment, because that intervention is anything that is unique and different that is being introduced in that study. And by the way, that includes some of the measurements, because that is unique and different. You wouldn't be doing that outside the study. All of those items are interventions in nature. Now we have obviously focus interventions. That's the curcumin, the exercise, the coffee, the stairs. But yes, we call them intervention because we intervene into the person's otherwise normal life.
Okay, fantastic. All right, well, that's awesome. Let's get back to the kind of traditional classic phases that you were about to outline for us.
Yeah. Now, I am notorious for kind of being squishy with the different phases, so I'm going to talk about them in the way I do. And for any of your listeners who are like, "That's not quite right," your listeners probably are right, because I've now been far enough away from the pharmaceutical world that sometimes I get a little careless with the definitions. So phase one and phase two are very early stage studies, and oftentimes they're combined, but not always. And they're generally there to establish overall safety and dosing levels. Can someone tolerate this? Does it create really bad side effects, etc.? Phase three is generally where you start to say there's something really powerful and going on here, because you might get some positive outcomes from your phase one and phase two. Phase three is where you really test your hypothesis. Is this intervention going to reduce cholesterol? Is it going to improve sleep? Whatever your hypothesis might be. And if you're in the pharmaceutical world, that phase three is really the one that you're kind of holding your breath, crossing your fingers, and hoping that everything's going to produce right. And these phase three trials can be extremely expensive. Phase three trials are also very frequently the trials where there is a multi-arm design. Very frequently, particularly in disease states where there are relatively few individuals, phase one and phase two do not always have a randomization approach. That is a fallacy. That only pharmaceutical trials are always a randomized control trial. They are not, because sometimes you don't have enough people to actually do reasonable randomization, particularly when we're talking about orphan diseases. And then phase four is typically considered post-market, which is done after the drug has been released into the market, but not always. And they tend to have much larger sample sizes to identify ongoing trends.
Okay, okay. And so talk to us about some of the problems with the way things are currently done. And I'll bring you one up that you and I talked about privately to start with. And I don't know if you call it a problem, maybe a limitation or something like that. So basically, we talked about how often those trials are kind of done where people are paid to participate and they're not necessarily seeking out a solution to that issue. And so then in a way, they're not really representative of the average person who would actually choose to take that later on. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah. So in the research world now, there's something called the reproducibility crisis, which is pervasive across all sectors, but particularly in psychology, where the research study is originally done in an academic setting, and then there is an effort to reproduce that same study in a different setting or in another academic environment or in another clinical location. And the results can't be reproduced. The results are different. Now, the scientific process, and this is also really important, one study does not create definitive proof. One study, you do another study, you do a third study, you do a fourth study, and if they're all pointing the same direction, that's where you start to be able to say there's evidence. So this problem in the reproducibility world is that if there is a result in the first study, but then there isn't money to do the second study, or that second study is done, but we don't get the same results, it means that we are not producing the level of evidence across any sector that we really should be. Because either that second study never gets done, or it gets done, but the results do not point in the same direction as the original one does. One of the hypotheses that is kind of circling around, and I'm probably one of the bigger proponents of this at the moment, is that the way research studies induce participants to engage may be one of the things that creates this problem with being able to reproduce in the real world. And that is, generally speaking, research studies pay participants to be involved in that research study, whether it's a gift card or an incentive or a token of appreciation. There's some kind of payment. In some studies, that's really important. If you are in a cancer study and you have to travel many hundreds, even thousands of miles to your local to a clinical site, you should be paid because there's significant costs associated with it. But what we need to recognize is that when we take these kind of lifestyle programs out into the real world, we're not paying people to do certain things. We're not paying people to collect data on them. We're not paying people to walk up the stairs or to drink coffee. And it doesn't take a behavioral economist to recognize that that payment actually creates some pretty strong incentives to do something that somebody wouldn't necessarily do otherwise. And so that may cause this issue with, number one, it makes the studies a lot more expensive to start out with. And so maybe that next study doesn't get done. And number two, when those next studies do get done, but they're done without the incentive, or we're trying to reproduce those results in the real world, because we're not paying people anymore, the results could be very different. And that is a concern that I have with research in the moment, both from the perspective of how do we get the cost of research down to a point where a much broader group of people can do so, and at the point where in real life we don't pay people to walk up the stairs. So how do we know that original result is going to hold water when we pull it out of the research study?
The thing that makes sense to me, because talk about double-blind placebo-controlled trial, and then the word that's often missed from that is placebo, right? And the power of the mind to create an effect is so extremely powerful that's why it's insisted upon often by experts and authorities that it has to be a double-blind study for it to be valid, and yet. The placebo effect of someone seeking out an intervention, a solution for whatever it is that they want to achieve, and then doing something proactive to make that happen, versus someone who's deciding to only do something because they want money. And I know you said, obviously sometimes people are being paid and it's completely justified, but I'm thinking more of the classic, college, university student, they're poor, they go into, they take this tablet, they don't even know what it is or what it's supposed to do. They certainly aren't looking for a solution to the problem of what it's supposed to be. And, that's not a natural environment, and it completely skews the results. That just seems extremely logical to me.
Yes. And it's a concern I have, and I have noted that other researchers are starting to wonder about it as well. So it's we're not alone in this, though it does continue to be a standard practice, less so than maybe it was a generation ago, but still standard practice in a lot of research studies to provide some kind of incentive for participation.
It's very interesting that a lot of these scientific authorities want to remove all variables possible, in the way that we talked about. Maybe they only, some of them say only one ingredient at a time could be tested or whatever, and yet at the same time they don't see that gap between the outcome of someone who isn't seeking a solution and doesn't need it versus someone who proactively is seeking a solution, and that they may have very different effects from the same thing. It's extremely reasonable and logical to me, and so.
You have to recognize that these people, that these researchers, they're trying really hard. They're doing whatever they can to get the research participants into their office to do whatever it is that they're trying to do. And it is not recruiting participants into a research study in a traditional kind of pharmaceutical or academic environment is extremely difficult.
So why is that?
So they're doing whatever.
You would think, and you said you studied marketing, or that was your expertise. So surely that's just a message market match issue. Like whatever it is that this thing is supposed to be for, this drug, this whatever other intervention, there must be people out there who'd love to try it because they would like that outcome. So why is it so difficult?
Oh, this is probably a whole podcast in itself. There are an innumerable number of reasons. One of the key ones in a lot of kind of traditional clinical settings is that they're looking for a very, very, very specific individual, almost a needle in a haystack individual. And so it takes a lot to actually find that individual. And then if you're in a clinical research study, and let's say that you have some advanced stage cancer and it's a placebo-controlled trial, do you want to go in that placebo-controlled trial when you might not actually get the intervention? You're going to get a placebo? The answer is probably no. And so there is that orientation of things as well. And then there's just the, and this is kind of where my head's at the moment. A lot of the research that I see being done at the moment, while I am so happy it's there, for, knock on wood, for me in the future if I ever were to get sick, it isn't necessarily what I am interested in for myself right now. And so it is really important that research that a lot of academics in the pharmaceutical world are doing, it's really important they continue it. It does mean that it's really expensive and really difficult to find those people. It also means that a lot of folks that are in my position at the moment, and maybe yours as well, and maybe many of your listeners, the kinds of studies that I am interested in for my life at the moment are not there, and so I'm not being recruited into them. The reality is, I think the last data that I saw is that about 95% of Americans felt that that being involved in clinical research was important, but only about 5% actually engage because there isn't the opportunity for them to do so. There's no research study that they're qualified for. And those that they are qualified for are in a different city, in a different location, or difficult to get to. And so they don't engage.
Okay. That all makes sense, certainly about the placebo control thing. You'd think if you were really hungry for an objective, a goal, you'd be willing to take a 50-50 shot. Maybe it's going to be the thing, maybe it's not.
Some people are, but it does make it a somewhat harder sell, right?
Absolutely makes sense. Yes. And then the other thing you said, I think makes, is more of an explanation even at the end there, which is, it's worth, let's say if I don't know, if I was overweight and I really, really want to lose weight and I tried all the diets and nothing had worked and someone offered a pill that they said could make me lose weight, I'd be really keen to try that. But of course, if there's a 50% chance it was not going to work, if it was not even going to be the real thing, that would be off-putting to some degree. But still, if that was a goal that I was really interested in, I might be willing to give it a shot. But what you just said makes sense. Most of the things being offered aren't like that. They're very, very niche for very, very specific problems that are very, very extreme, very debilitating, but a very small percentage of people have.
Again, so glad that that's happening, because if I were to be one of those people, I'm very glad that those options are available.
Yeah. It's not to criticize it, but if you're being, what's the word, utilitarian or something like that, it's like I'd rather try and focus my efforts to help the maximum amount of people, or maybe it's the capitalist in me, right? What's the least investment for the most return I could make in terms of helping, the most people with their health, kind of thing. Okay, well, that brings us nicely then, I think, to Efforia and what you're doing. So can we say, actually, and before we get into what you're doing, explain it, can we just touch on what you just said there about the benefit for the participant? So obviously one benefit is just that you get to try something new that may really work and transform your life. So that in itself is awesome. But that's not the only benefit, right? So what other benefits are there for participating in a trial?
Well, you can learn about yourself. Oftentimes, clinical research, particularly at the kind of basic research knowledge, is positioned as you're helping society, and that's true. But you're also learning about yourself. Is that coffee going to help you? Is that going up the stairs going to help you? Is that moving the needle from your perspective? And that's really important. Again, going back to that very early example that I gave of the caveman, humans evolved to self-experiment. It's only been in the past 50 to 100 years that we've delegated that self-experimentation to somebody else. And that ability to understand what works for you and what doesn't is really important, because we have to recognize, again, Mr. Rogers in Sesame Street taught me that I was unique and special. So what's going to work for me is going to be very different than what's going to work from you. So being involved in the right kind of clinical research study where you are getting your information back and you're seeing how that information at the end of the study compares with others, that's valuable information that you can use to make future decisions for yourself and then more broadly for the world.
Absolutely. And I'd expand upon that because, the berry example you gave, as you said, it's very simple. It's like, does it taste good or not? Spit it out. But a lot of the time with things, especially that are non-pharmaceutical, that are more lifestyle interventions or dietary interventions or nutritional interventions like supplements, the effects are either subtle or quite often they take time to manifest. And so often a person is either doing no interventions or they're doing loads. That would be the way I would characterize it. And it is very difficult to be able to delineate and keep track. I'd say one of the main things I do with long-term clients is kind of just remind them of, and help them see and all the rest of it as well. But ultimately, they're like, oh, this problem came back again. Oh, well, I thought we'd resolved this 6 months ago. And I'm like, oh, okay, then. And I'm like, right, what were we doing 6 months ago? Are you still doing all these things? Oh, no, actually, I stopped doing this. I stopped doing this. Oh, that's interesting. When did you stop this? Oh, I stopped that, 3 months ago. Oh, right. And, did the problem? Oh, yeah, actually, now you come to mention it, a week or two later, the problem started coming back. It's like, okay, well, that obviously wasn't fully resolved yet. Maybe it's nutritional deficiency. It's still there partly. You got to start taking it again. So, like and I work with, generally very intelligent, very accomplished people who are certainly not foolish. And yet, they are not seeing the cause and effect relationship often of trying these interventions and having the outcome because it's not immediate. I think the way that our brains generally work is, if I eat something and then within a minute I start violently vomiting, I'm going to see that connection. It's going to be viscerally wired into my brain. And I'm almost certainly not going to do that again. But if I start eating something and 2 days later I start violently vomiting, I'm not going to see that connection, even if that may be how long it's taken to get to the large intestine and create that effect. But the brain doesn't get it. The reptilian part of the brain doesn't get it. The prefrontal cortex has to kind of explain to it that that's what's going on, and you might still try it again because you don't really quite believe that's what caused it. And that's 2 days. Now imagine you're taking something like often nutrients do that take 2 or 3 months to work. And then by the time they actually start working, you've completely forgotten what you were like 2 or 3 months ago. And then the other thing is there's this wonderful capacity of the human brain whereby even if we've had a really bad acute problem for a long time, let's say chronic pain is one that this often comes up, chronic back pain. And let's say that we do something that actually works to get rid of it after 20 years. A month later, if someone says, how's your back? You'd be like, what about my back? And they'd be like, remember, yeah, I used to have back pain. So it's so easy to forget about the problem once it's resolved because of the brain's protective mechanism. Who wants to remember being in pain for 20 years? It makes sense. So for all these reasons, and probably many more that maybe you know some more, Matthew, that I don't, but there are so many reasons why it is really hard to keep track of what isn't working. And it's supplements, but also with dietary changes, and maybe you go on a coaching program. It's so hard to be able to tell. So if you participate in the clinical trial, does that help you to actually keep track of, and then also later, have a record of, what does and doesn't work?
In an ideal world, you'd meet all of your nutritional needs in the form of vitamins, minerals, phytonutrients, and more from the foods you eat. However, unless you prepare all of your food at home from scratch using the highest quality ingredients possible, the reality is that most of us need some nutritional support. Most of us need to take supplements if we want to look, feel, and perform at our best on a consistent daily basis. And this is especially true if you have genes that give you an elevated need of certain nutrients. And this is where Feel Younger can help. What I love about Feel Younger is that they offer a huge range of quality supplements and healthcare products formulated and endorsed by Owen Robinson, including must-haves like magnesium glycinate and vitamins B12, D3, and K2. And they do it at affordable prices with free shipping for orders over $50 without ever compromising on quality, purity, or potency. To learn more about how Feel Younger supplements can give your health a boost while supporting this podcast, please visit feelyounger.net and use promo code Rejuvenate to get 20% off your first order. That's promo code Rejuvenate for 20% off your first order at feelyounger.net.
If you are in a clinical trial that is giving you results back, definitely it does. I mean, very few of us have the resources or even interest that if your listeners are familiar with Brian Johnson, who claims to be spending about $2 million a year, not just on the interventions for longevity, but also for all of the tracking that he does to see whether these interventions work. Love him or hate him, he's doing some interesting stuff. But again, he is tracking on just himself, and there may be things that he's doing that is not going to work for me. They might work for 95% of the population, but not for me because I'm in that 5%. And without that $2 million, how do I find out if I'm in that 5%? It's tough.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, so tell us about Efforia. This, I have to say, of all the companies I've heard of in the last maybe even 10 years, yours is the one where I was most immediately like, this is the best idea ever. And I'm sure it's going to be very, very highly successful. I know you're doing well already. because it's such a great idea. It's such a revolutionary thing. So I'm sorry if I built it up too much, but I'm saying from
Well, I am. I'm
the
sorry.
bottom of my
I'm
heart,
rethinking my pitch here. Yeah.
that's how I feel about it. So I'm so excited to be able to share this with our audience. Tell us about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Going back to kind of my last company, which ended up, for better or worse, primarily working in pharmaceutical and academic sectors because that's where the money was. When I exited that company, I didn't think I was going to do clinical research again. I figured I've been there, done that. I'm going to, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I'm going to go on, and I wanted to do a cookbook application. I love to cook, so I thought that's where I was going to go next. But I happened to look at my credit card statement one day, and I saw multiple subscriptions to dietary supplements, multiple memberships to various digital health apps, to gyms, to Peloton. For those not in the US and the UK, it's a exercise service. I also had a yoga subscription. Just a fairly significant amount of money in that credit card statement, all for these kind of health, fitness, longevity, prevention type stuff. And that didn't count any of the kind of traditional stuff like going to the doctor and the dentist, and insurance copays and those sorts of things. Existing in both the world as a consumer, as well as someone who has been in the world of clinical research for a while, it became really clear to me that all of these providers, they have tools to manage every aspect of the customer lifecycle. They have advertising infrastructure. You've got the shipping and logistics tools. You've got the email tools to keep people to retain customers. The subscription tools to keep them coming back over and over again. Except none of them have any tool or any capacity to easily prove to me, the customer, that the investment that I'm making is actually helping me reach my health goals. And when you step back and think about that for a second, that's crazy. That would be unacceptable in any other industry. It would be a little bit like me going to the car dealership down the street after doing a lot of research, buying a car, bringing that car home, driving it for a couple of months, and then still not being able to say for certain if that car is getting me from point A to point B. It doesn't take any level of cultural expertise to recognize that that creates a lot of overall cynicism, because this is not regulated just to kind of the health and wellness world. It is across kind of the entire healthcare ecosystem for anyone who is not in a serious disease state. I knew that the solution for this particular issue was not, even when we are on a podcast here, I didn't want to be another talking head. There are plenty of those individuals out there already, many of them who are very good. And increasingly, I see kind of the sub genre of those individuals. All they do is argue with each other over some small piece of research that probably doesn't apply to anyone other than the 60 people that were originally in those research studies. Likewise, I knew the world did not need another decentralized clinical trial solution for pharma and academia, because the kinds of stuff that I was starting to see bubble up, the kinds of stuff that I was seeing in my credit card statement, it's not that those organizations and institutions didn't want to do research studies. It's that they couldn't afford to do the research studies in the way that they are being conducted in pharma and academia. And quite frankly, a lot of times, pharma and academia is not particularly happy with the price points of those studies either. So we got together with a variety of us who were at my prior company and kind of said, there's got to be a way here where we can open up this much broader set of the market. Because if there is one thing where I will challenge a lot of folks that are outside of this kind of prevention, longevity, naturopath, alternative space, is that their assumption is that no one in those spaces care about evidence. None of them want to do a clinical research study because everyone's just a carnival huckster selling their latest snake oil. And that is absolutely not the case. Now, there may be some bad actors, as there are everywhere, but most individuals in this world, in many cases, are doing this because they have a deep-seated belief themselves that they want to do some good, that they want to improve themselves, they want to improve their community, etc. I knew, however, again, that traditional clinical trial model was not going to work. unless someone's got a big pot of 6 or 7 figures to do a clinical research study, which very few organizations do, those studies are not going to get done.
And even then, just to remind people, even if you have the money, you're kind of throwing it away because you can't patent it, so someone can easily just copy you and there's nothing you can do about it.
Right, right. So what we decided to do was really rethink the clinical trial business model. So what we're doing here at Efforia is essentially taking the purchases that consumers are already making and transforming them into individual self-experiments that stack into a clinical trial. So each one of those individual self-experiments is exactly the same, but unique to that individual. They follow the same protocol. And then because they've done so, we can stack them on top of each other and get full clinical trial outcomes. What that means for a participant is that they can actually join that research study and answer the question for themselves: does this work for me to reach my particular health goal? Yes or no, or maybe. And they can use that information just the same way that we evolved as humans to use that information, like that caveman is: yes, this worked for me. No, it didn't. I can continue to eat those berries. I can tell my village. I can decide not to eat those berries and tell my village. I can, in modern day speak, that is essentially I can continue to spend my time and money, or I can decide not to spend my time and money based on what the outcomes were. That's something that most organizations in the broader health and wellness ecosystem can't do at the moment. They can't say this changed your cholesterol level or this improved your sleep. That's very difficult for most organizations to do. At the same time, for those brands, those providers, those researchers, we are actually getting clinical trial outcomes as well, because we are stacking each one of those N of 1 trials on top of each other. And because we are taking a transaction fee on the products and services that consumers are already purchasing, we are able to do so without any upfront costs. Like I said, a more traditional clinical research trial, even outside of the pharma sector, can easily cost well into the 6 figures. In this particular model, we are essentially saying, you know what, we know you don't have 6 figures, and that's okay. But we also know that your primary goal, we talked about capitalism at the beginning of this conversation, you got to make rent, right? And so your primary goal, at least one of them, is to earn revenue. So we are going to partner with you as opposed to a time and materials budget, which is very common in a clinical research trial, or a software as a service based fee that may or may not have anything to do with your actual goals. We're saying, let's work together and we're going to try to sell this in a research study together.
Which is absolutely fantastic. What would you say to someone, and I probably gave the game already that I don't feel this way, but what would you say to someone that would say this is not real research or not legitimate research, or maybe they're imagining that all other clinical trials are done kind of in hospitals with 24-hour monitoring and stuff like that? Like, is that the case, or are a lot of trials actually done this way?
It's not the case. As we started, I started my career in HIV prevention research, right? And in those situations, we couldn't get the people that we wanted to include in those research into a clinic-based setting because it was inconvenient, and in that case, actually may have put them at harm because it may have outed them to the community when they didn't want to. Decentralized trials, those are trials where an individual doesn't necessarily go into a research setting, are increasingly common now. We do have trials, by the way, that do require individuals to go into some kind of clinic location, but it's a relatively small component of them. As far as whether these are real trials or not, I have one very flippant answer to that question, and then one that is more appropriate. So let me take the appropriate one.
Okay.
The first is that every trial on Efforia follows the same regulations, the same processes as any trial in academia or pharma. Now, most of the trials on Efforia are not regulated trials, meaning that we are not working with an organization that is trying to make a disease claim on a dietary supplement, and for the most part, are we working with organizations that have a new novel drug. Now, that is to say, maybe 10% of our studies do, and so there are FDA and EMA paperwork that we do file, but all studies otherwise, they do go through something called an IRB review in the United States. It's the same process in Europe, but you call it an ethics review. This confirms that we're following a variety of regulations and processes, and that the research study has general, I think the terminology is technically called beneficence, that provides some value to the world. So same process, same irritations. It's just that we use a lot of technology to scale these processes that are uncommon in the traditional research world, so that we can operate at the scale that we do. The more flippant answer to the question largely comes from, I think, a misunderstanding that there is a such thing as a perfect study. There is no such thing. Every study has bias associated with it, even if that bias is as simple as who has funded the study and who is conducting the study and where the study is conducted. Every study has bias. There is no perfect study design. Sometimes a placebo-controlled trial is perfect and great, and we go for it. Sometimes a placebo-controlled trial is logistically impossible. I still have not figured out how to do a placebo-controlled trial when we're talking about cold plunge tanks.
Good point.
How do I do that? I don't know. And so it's not real research because it's not the perfect trial. There is no such thing. Again, the scientific method is a repeated trial that has slightly different study designs at slightly different time points and slightly different populations that all point in the same direction. It is not one perfect trial. It's just not. It's just not a thing.
I love that answer. Well, I love both the answers, but I love that one because it made me think with the cold plunge one, you could actually extrapolate that madly, because if you're going to say that, massively, because if you're going to say that only placebo-controlled trials are evidence or proof of the efficacy of an intervention, what you're basically saying is the only thing that can ever be proven to be effective is something that can be hidden in a pill. Because really, you can't do a fake cold plunge, as you just said, but you can't do a fake exercise regime. You can't do, a fake healthy meal.
There are other kinds of controls. So the placebo is when you're actually introducing a sham.
But that's what I'm saying. But I'm saying, like, you can't. A person is going to know if they're eating a healthy meal versus an unhealthy meal. A person is going to know if they're going for a walk or a jog or whatever versus not going for a walk or a jog. A person is going to know if they're getting fresh air 8 hours a day. A person is going to know if they're walking several hours a day. A person is going to, all of these things which are natural and healthy, it's not possible to run a placebo-controlled trial on, because it's not possible to hide from the person that they're having that intervention. So it's actually a really big point you're making. I'd expand beyond just cold plunging.
Yeah, it is. And there are some sectors, like in the social service world, it is considered, and increasingly I've heard it even in some medical sectors, it's considered unethical to provide a placebo. If you're going back to that cancer study example that I described before, if you are an end-stage cancer patient and you're a pharmaceutical organization and a clinician and you have a treatment that you are 90% sure is going to cure their cancer, is it ethical to give them a placebo?
It's a great point.
I don't think so. Yeah.
No.
But I want to make very clear that placebos are not the only controls. You can do a control that's just something slightly different. But again, still there is this knowledge that one person is getting one thing and another person is getting another. One of the reasons we include a placebo or some kind of control is to address bias. There are other ways to address bias as well. Most trials on Efforia include something called a treatment expectancy scale at the beginning of the study. And so we stratify the results based on those individuals who have a very high opinion of whatever the product and service is that that is being studied versus those that have a relatively low. And we compare, does an individual going into the study, do their opinions and biases affect the outcomes? And we look at that. Again, that is particularly when we're doing a study for the very first time with a dietary supplement company who's never done a trial before. All of a sudden introducing a placebo would be like going to pharma and saying, you need to skip phase 1 and 2 and go directly to phase 3. So we kind of ease them into it, and we kind of say, let's get a signal first. And that signal gives us some indication that there's something going on. And then if the signal's there, then maybe we can do a placebo-controlled trial next, or maybe we can find another control later in that subsequent trial. And because we're not telling telling that organization, hey, you've got to have $100,000 for this first trial, and then by the way, we're going to move to that second trial, and you're going to need $300,000 for that second trial, and then by the way, we're going to go to that phase 4 trial, and you might need $1 million for that. No dietary supplement company is going to be able to do that. But if we kind of go into it and say, hey, let's see if there's a signal there. We'll take 20 or 30% on a transaction fee, and if something's there, we'll just repeat that, and we'll do it in a placebo-controlled environment. We'll take 20, 30% of that, and if there's something there, we can continue. And at that point, because maybe there's some great evidence there, everyone's happy. Or maybe in that signal phase, we determine that there's nothing there, and they go back and reformulate and come back to us and say, hey, we've got a slightly different formula here. We'd like to try and see if we can get a better outcome with this one.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Wow. So, I'm a big fan of this, obviously, as I've made clear. For people who are not business owners, or who are not wanting to run a trial on their own, intervention, whatever it might be, but who want to participate in trials. Obviously, one of them, feelyounger.net/hormetics. We have some of our own running that we if you're looking at losing weight in a healthy way in general, and if you're looking at balancing this, we have a formula for leptin, we have a formula for insulin, we have a formula for metabolism, we have a formula for estrogen, we have a formula for cortisol. They may all be available, and they may be upcoming at some of them at the time that this is released. But that's one way you can participate in a trial. But what's another way? Is there another resource people can go to see other trials they may want to participate in?
Continue exploring those brands and providers that you have some interested in, but haven't kind of pulled the trigger yet. Because many of them, once you make that purchase, you will be pre-eligible to join a trial on Efforia. We have 80 or so currently active, and the only way almost all of them are invite only at the moment. And the only way that you can get in is that you make one of those original purchases. So just keep your eye out for some of the purchases that you're making, and within the next couple of months, given the demand, we have realized that we're going to need to be a little bit more kind of consumer facing, and so we will be putting a directory together that you'll be able to access at Efforia.com, that will give you kind of a catalog of different studies that you can join. It's a good thing that we've had this problem. We anticipated that we'd kind of be behind the scenes, but just given the number of emails that I wade through every morning saying, "Where's this trial?" It's become clear that we've got to be a little bit more out there. And then the final thing is, for those of you in the United States, take a look at clinicaltrials.gov. All of the trials that we run on Efforia, except for a very small few, are all listed on clinicaltrials.gov, and it will give you information on how you can join.
Oh, fantastic. And it's going to be at least a few weeks before this comes out. So by the time you watch this, that directory may well be available. So go to Efforia.com. And then for those who let's clarify this. Does it have to be a business owner? I've had various people on here. One of them, for instance, this year, several times, who has this revolutionary protocol he believes of different nutrients, and a lot of people are doing it and saying, yeah, it feels great. A lot of people are saying, not sure if it's working. A lot of people are saying, this is all nonsense. You have no proof that this is really working. And of course, what I just said is a microcosm of really what's going on in the whole industry, as you just said, because no one really has anything.
It's the whole world. If I can do some good in the world with this, I am starting to tire of the continued arguing around opinions. And what I would love to be able to do is insert into the world and essentially say, I don't have an answer here. I don't know what the appropriate and definitive solution is for you or for you or for you. What I do know is that there is a process where we can come up and determine what is going to work for us based on collecting appropriate data before and after, and maybe including some comparisons. It's called the scientific method, and we have made that easy for anyone to do. A lot of, in my prior companies, what I used to do manually, it took 3 months, sometimes even longer, to design a research study. We now have an AI guide. We call it the AI Design Assistant, that allows anyone who has any kind of research question to a health research question. If you're interested in birding and stuff like that, it's not going, or geology, it's not going to do that. It will walk you through the steps of designing a treatment protocol, identifying a hypothesis, and identifying the measures to test that hypothesis. And then at the end of that process, it takes 5 to 10 minutes. It will operationalize that study for you with tools and measures and interventions that are already within the Efforia system. So, and if it's not in the Efforia system already, remember, even if you just have an idea, it still works. We're not a time and materials based organization. Anyone can come and design a study, and under research regulations, by the way, we do have to provide some on our platform for free. And so if it's just an idea that you have that's about walking up the stairs and there is no revenue associated with it, we are still interested in those as well, because we have to have them for regulatory purposes.
Wow, amazing. So actually there's no cost. I mean, what an incredible thing. So I love this. What you just said earlier about, how some of your colleagues in the more mainstream world feel that everyone in my industry are all, hucksters and all the rest of it, snake oil salesmen. I know you don't agree with that because, as you just said, you are a customer of those kind of people. I get that. But
I don't know what it is in the UK or in Europe, but as are about 77% of Americans take a dietary supplement. It is not the prevailing wisdom, but just because they're taking that dietary supplement doesn't mean that they know that it works. It's, again, me in that car analogy. We don't know if it's getting us back and forth to work every day, but we hope it is. And what we're trying to do here at Efforia is close that loop for each individual.
I think what you're doing is fantastic. And what we're trying to do at the Rejuvenate podcast, first of all, we're focused on addressing and resolving the root causes of chronic disease specifically, not the rare genetic ones that, you're talking about, but really the chronic diseases that most people are suffering with. And I've identified kind of 7 categories of root causes. And so that's what we talk about on most episodes. But what I have observed so often, the biggest challenge I face in the feedback I receive is people kind of like having an attitude of, does it work or not? And I always have to say it depends, because the other big mission of this podcast is to teach people about this concept of personalized medicine or personalized health optimization, which recognizes that we're all different. We all have a different starting place in terms of our genetics, which is why one of my companies is Advanced Self Genetics that helps people ascertain, what their starting place is, which is not the be all and end all, but it is still a significant factor that has to be taken into account. And then second of all, there is, a myriad other environmental factors from the moment of birth that are not genetic that also make your specific needs and requirements different in order to be optimal. And just even the idea that, it's like take 2 tablets in the morning, but the same kind of dose is given to a 120-pound person as a 300-pound person. It doesn't make sense to me. Even that level should be personalized. But we have to realize that's the same for clinical trials. Even if there is a clinical trial saying, 1,000 people have tried this and, it was effective enough that we can say that this definitely works. We can say it definitely works for most people, but is there ever anything that has like a 100% success rate? There's always exceptions, right? And so that's why I think as compelling as it is for companies or creators of interventions like me to put them to the test with technology like this, which is fantastic, it should also be really compelling to you, even if you're not a creator of an intervention, to participate in this, because just because it works for 95% of people doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work for you. And so it's so awesome that you're making this available.
The other thing that's really important about that is just because it works for you now doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for you in 3 months. For those of us that live in a climate at the moment that is starting to shift into fall, let's say that you've got a dermatology issue. Just the change going from kind of humid summer weather into drier winter weather, that has a huge impact on what you might be using for your skincare routine. And so it is a continuous process of self-experimentation, not just between individuals, but among the same individual in different environments and time points.
Absolutely right. Yes, that's not static either. Absolutely. Yeah. So great point. And so for those who have created interventions, or even if it's not one that you've created, but you feel like it hasn't been tested and you feel like it should be, and you want to instigate that, how do people do that?
You can go Efforia.com and click on the link, and it will guide you through the process of adding your interventions. If you use Shopify, all you have to do is install a Shopify app, Squarespace. If you happen to be a spa provider, we have just recently released an integration with MindBody that will allow you to integrate all of that. And so it's not just kind of pills and lotions and potions and tangible products. We also do full scale services now too.
Awesome. Yeah, and I know you do a lot of wearables, like tracking devices, and as you said, you work with even if you're a coach and what you do is you guide people through a program or something like that. You work with those kind of people with that as well, right?
Yeah, we do. And you can, if you prefer, to send us an email and get more information, just help@Efforia.com and we'll get right back to you. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Well, this has been amazing, Matthew. Is there anything you wish I'd have asked you before we finish?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for being on. Thank you for the work that you're doing. We just probably have just started the hormetics trial at the point that this will come out. So maybe we can have you on in the future and we can talk about how it's gone and, maybe, what we've learned and share with people the
Yeah,
results.
that'd be
And
great.
okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. So go to efforia.com to find out more whether you want to participate in a study or whether you want to create one.
I was just going to say, thank you very much. This was great.
Fantastic. And remember to comment, especially if you're on YouTube or Rumble, and subscribe. I don't check Rumble, but I do check YouTube. So any comments you leave in YouTube, I will actually answer, and I always appreciate it. And I'll see you for the next episode. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed that, I recommend watching our latest episode, which you can do by clicking above. And make sure to subscribe, like the video, comment, and share with anyone who you think might appreciate it. Thank you.